So our next guest is Senator Cory Booker. And that's impressive when you get a standing ovation before you've even been introduced. So we are so honored to have Senator Booker join us today. He was raised in Harrington Park, living his life as a proud New Jerseyan. He received his undergrad degree from Stanford University and was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship and went on to receive an honors degree in history from the University of Oxford. After law school, Senator Booker moved back to Newark, where he still lives today, and he started a nonprofit organization to provide legal services for low-income families and to help tenants take on slumlords, improve living conditions, and stay in their homes. So he's a true housing champion from the beginning. At the age of 29, Senator Booker was elected to the Newark City Council, where he served for 17 years before being elected mayor. And during his 7 years as mayor of Newark, he worked to create and preserve affordable homes, among many other accomplishments. He's been a U.S. Senator since 2013, and he's risen to national fame, both as a strident champion of criminal justice reform and civil rights, and as a voice of civility and bipartisanship in a time of deep political division. In office, Senator Booker has introduced legislation to expand federal protections to bar discrimination against LGBTQ individuals in housing, education, and employment. And he has introduced legislation to provide renters stronger protection. So please join me in welcoming Senator Cory Booker.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Please stand. I feel like I should be applauding everyone in here. I was with some high school students from New Jersey today, and I asked them if they know who Alice Walker is, and I almost got crushed when I didn't get any knowing eyes about this great American author. But I told them that she has this chapter called about Black revolutionaries, and it's really the truth about revolutionaries, where she says, and I quote, "The real revolutionary is always concerned with the least glamorous stuff, with raising a child's reading level from 3rd grade to 4th, with filling out food stamp forms for folks because people have to eat, revolution or not. The real revolutionary is always close enough to the people to be there for them when they're needed." And I want you to know, I feel like I'm in a room full of revolutionaries, for people who are staying close to what the real issues are. They may not be sexy, they may not be glamorous, but what I know firsthand from my entire sort of adult experience or post-university experience, that the area that we are operating in this community of advocates, housing advocates, I know that this is the area that makes the most difference to communities, to families, to our country as a whole. And I see lots of people I know out here, people from Newark in the house. And so maybe I'll start with that confession. I always say I got my BA from Stanford, but my PhD on the streets of Newark, and it was professors. It was professors in Newark, some of my greatest life teachers, who were housing advocates. Everything that I am, my life, in fact, I wrote a book where I hailed a number of these people from my community who just took me under their wing at a time in my life and shaped me. The first person I often talk about is a woman who lived on the 5th floor of the projects across the street from where I moved when I was still a law student. I made a decision to move into the tough neighborhood I could find in a city that I loved. And you all know the joke that Chris Rock tells. Why is it often the most violent street in every city is named after the man that stood for nonviolence? I moved onto the south end of Martin Luther King Boulevard. It is a neighborhood that's changed a lot in these last 20 years, but we had a young man, Shahad Smith, killed last week by an assault weapon at the top of that block. And there's still challenges. But back in the 90s, it was really, at least I perceived it to be off the hook. And I moved there and immediately started seeing problems and challenges. I moved into a boarding house right next to a crack house right across the street from the projects where Miss Virginia Jones lived. And I'll never forget sort of feeling overwhelmed by it all. But then I meet this woman, and I still remember I was a law student at the time, and I had this swagger of law students, and I walked over to her, and knocked on her door, and she's like, "Who are you?" And I'm like, "I'm Cory Booker, I'm here to help you." and she looks at me with this look like, "You are the one that needs help, young man. You seriously need help." And one of the things she did with me early, one of the great moments of my life, she brings me down to Martin Luther King Boulevard, and she says, "Tell me what you see. What you see." Remember this, because I'll end with this idea of sight. Remember what you see around you. Tell me what you see around you, she says. And I said to her, "What do you mean?" She goes, "Describe the neighborhood." And I said, "Okay, well, I see the projects, I see crack house." I just started describing the neighborhood like I described to you. And the more I talked, the more just disappointed she looked, and even angry. And then finally she says to me, "Well, you can't help me." And she starts walking away from me quickly. And so I'm like, okay, I run after her, like I'm confused. And I run after her, I grab her from behind, very respectfully, mind you. Miss Jones was a lot shorter than me, but she was larger than life. And she wheels around and she goes, "What?" She goes, "I don't understand." She goes, "Boy, you need to understand this. The world you see outside of you is a reflection of what you have inside of you. And if you're one of those people who only sees problems and darkness and despair, that's all there's ever going to be. But if you're one of those stubborn people who every time you open your eyes, you see hope, you see opportunity, you see love, you see the face of God, then you can be one of those people who helps me." And she leaves me there on the street. And so this is the exciting thing for me about being in a room full of folk like us. You know, Miss Jones taught me. Her son was murdered in the lobby of the building I would eventually move into. I lived in Brick Towers for about almost 10 years. And she taught me that hope is not this funny feeling that you get because circumstances change or you see some light at the end of a tunnel. No, hope is the active conviction that despair will never have the last word. That you are going to be an agent of hope, an instrument of hope. That you are going to be a manifestation of hope through your action, through your work, through your determination, never to give up. Now, this slumlord that owned Brick Towers before it was taken over by another slumlord at the time, the Housing Authority. Somebody, I can get a witness from somebody up here. And the slumlord, this guy was straight out of Central Casting. And Miss Jones, I'm telling you, she's like 5 feet and a smidgen tall. She was brought to court by the landlord for many things, one of which, at one time, she hauled off and punched the landlord in the face for his crimes. Don't clap for violence. I'm sorry. But you can clap for this because the judge looks at the slumlord, the big adult man, and then she looks at this elderly woman, and he just throws the case out of court. He's like, "You gotta be kidding me! Get out of here!" The reality is Miss Jones, she could have lived in a lot of places. She worked at the prosecutor's office in Newark, and she made enough money to move out of Brick Towers after her son was murdered, but she never ever left. And I'll tell you this, she saw Republican presidents, Democratic presidents. She saw good mayoral leadership, she saw bad mayoral leadership. She saw Republican governors, Democratic governors, but she just kept her hands on the plow. At Shahad's funeral last Friday, Miss Jones has passed away now for years, but here we all were, yet again in Brick Towers, the Brick Towers community. We have reunions every summer. Here we were yet again, all gathered together for a boy in a box. And the stories, though, about her will, her ferocious love, was still evident in the room. We couldn't all get together without talking about one person. Her physical body may be gone, but the energy and the light and the struggle that she did for us is still alive. And so much of who I am, she was one of the people that said, "You're going to run for office." And I was resistant. She's like, "Boy, why are you here? Are you here to help people, or are you here to do what you want to do?" I'm standing here right now because of tenant activists in Newark. They literally helped to lead my campaign. People like Frank Hutchins, Virginia Jones, were leaders on my campaign. They, tenant activists, would walk me to buildings that I had helped out as a young lawyer. Now they're walking me through buildings, knocking on every single door to talk to these tenant activists, talk to tenants, tenant presidents vouching for me. I cannot ever become an elected leader who forgets where I came from and why I'm here. And that's why your presence here is so important. You all know the story of our country, which is not the great man theory of history. It is not. Every right, every privilege that we enjoy in this democracy did not come from Washington. It wasn't these great men, even the founders, Jefferson or Lincoln or Kennedy or King, as great as they might have been. Remember your history. There's not a person here that's a woman that enjoys her right to vote and full citizenship rights because a bunch of men in Congress sat around and thought to themselves, well, it's about time that them women have the right to vote. No. Civil rights and voting rights didn't happen because Strom Thurmond was sitting up there thinking to himself, well, it's time the Negro people get some rights around here. No. All of these things happened because ordinary Americans like us did extraordinary things. They came to Washington with demands. We're going to see it on the 24th.
Yeah.
When hundreds of thousands of people. And so I just want you all to know that we have an urgency of this moment right now. My staff always gives me these cards and they put the data on them. I cannot believe this one data point they gave me about young black children being born and growing up in poverty. It's worse. Kids born from 1995 to 1970, and between 1955 and 1970, 62% of black children were raised in neighborhoods with concentrations of poverty. Now, kids born between 1985 and 2000, it's gone up to 66%. We have this shame in this country that we have, of all of our industrial peers, the highest child poverty rates. And it's not even just that. Our children in poverty, compared to our peers, have less access to health care, less access to housing. And we know we already are having our poor kids grow up in environmentally toxic places. In Camden to Newark, still drinking out of bottled water. I grew up in the northern suburbs of New Jersey, planting gardens with my father. When I tried to lead we eventually did it, but we had to do it in planter boxes for urban gardening, urban farms. The state EPA said, you can't plant in the soil. The soil is toxic. One of the first things I found out when I was a city council person was that we had toxic lead levels in the blood of our kids. Because there was no sense of urgency to deal with that. People think today we're done with the lead problem. They think Flint is an anomaly. You all know this. We live this in communities that we come from. The Reuters said over 1,000 jurisdictions, kids have twice the blood lead levels. And then you get to the housing practices, which are sinister. You have housing practices now from a president that we have to tell this Congress not to cut funding for home funds, for community development block grant funds, for the kind of tax credits we use to build it. All those things in the Trump budget have been up to be cut. We have now a reality here that the commitments of affordable housing, 50 years since the Affordable Housing Act, and we still haven't fulfilled them. We now face this situation in our communities where people who, for no fault of their own, are trying to take on a slumlord. And they go to court, and just by appearing in court, they get on these tenant blacklists that now they go try to rent, and they're being denied rental properties and have to end up, the only options they have is substandard housing. We have urgencies of this moment. And another one of these data points my staff puts on me, this great book, I have a book club. If you're named Booker, you've got to have a book club. A guy, Matthew Desmond, you read it, some of you read his book, Evicted, like, come on, Cory. It's like going into church and saying, anybody hear this book called the Bible? Well, Matthew Desmond, he referenced a whole bunch of data in there, but he just looked at how much does it cost a city to have a program that prevents people from being evicted. Emergency funding to keep people in the house. he found out that the program cost him $450,000, but it saved the city over $700,000 because all the costs associated with a family who's being evicted. And eviction, people think that not losing your job at work is what causes you being evicted, but it's more likely to be the other way around. Getting evicted makes you lose your job. And then we have my father, who grew up poor. He would correct me right now and say, don't tell those people, Cory, I was poor. Tell them the truth, I was P-O. I couldn't afford the other two letters. My dad, I didn't do so well in school, son, because I was so poor I couldn't pay attention. I'm like, Dad, come on. So my father, he used to always say, whenever he'd visit me, he lived in Atlanta for a while, then out in Nevada, he'd come visit me and walk around Newark with me where I lived, and he goes, the poor always pay more. Paying more at the bodega. People don't know how expensive it is to be poor. And what he would get frustrated about is that we create laws that prevent poor folk, low-income folk, from gaining assets. Literally, programs like LIHEAP and TANF and food stamps, they have caps on how much assets you can have. And then when one thing happens, and all of us have that one thing happen, some of it happens to us every month, where you have a financial emergency, and suddenly you have to pay out that $400, that $700 or something, and now what happens? You can't make the rental payment. And so now you're evicted. So these are the things we've got to fight to change. The list is longer than this. You and I, all of us know, we can write the list on how this nation does what is not even economically sensible. It's not even in our own economic well-being. The greatest asset, economic asset this country has is not oil or gas or coal or cobalt or steel. It's the genius of children. In a global knowledge-based society, it's the people that drive the economy, but yet we have a nation that takes large percentages of its population and puts them in conditions where that genius isn't nurtured. It's under attack, it's under assault. I mean, even just the fact that, I keep going back to these environmental toxins, because, Superfund sites, which are disproportionately low-income areas, we now know longitudinally, we have data from Princeton that shows if you're born around a Superfund site, you got about 20% higher rates of autism or birth defects. And so we here are not fighting for a physical structure or home. Yeah, we're fighting for that. But we're fighting for the ideal of the hearth, of the home that nurtures the most precious elements of our society, that helps them to grow up in environments that nurture their dreams, that empower their well-being, that help them to launch into this world. There's as many geniuses born, geniuses equally distributed. There's many geniuses being born in Beverly Hills as there are in Newark, New Jersey, or Camden, or Patterson, or Passaic. And this is what angers me. My car ride over here, I'm all upset about what's happening in Yemen because there's a massive famine going on, millions of people. There is cholera going on, one of the worst cholera outbreaks on the planet Earth right now, millions of people living in misery. And our military is engaged with the Saudis in a way that I think is not helping to stop this situation. And it's one of these moments where I'm looking at the price tag of like one bomb, one jet. And I'm thinking about the programs that we often have to beg for. Here we are involved with an ally, Saudi Arabia, who's bombing civilians, bombing their waste treatment plant, thus causing a lot of the problems with the cholera outbreak. And yet we can't find the resources to invest in programs that actually pay dividends to society as a whole. That we just pass a tax plan that literally, instead of targeting tax breaks and investments in our communities or directly towards low-income Americans that can help elevate kids out of poverty, that can help secure better housing, funding programs like they have the FHA that instead of funding Wall Street to bail them out when they do bad things to our economy, fund people who are now suddenly in these bad loans and are facing eviction, and allow community development of finance institutions to step up forward like we did in Newark. Instead of all of this, we seem to have the money to do everything else. Kick tax breaks to the wealthiest amongst us, find money to source our military, but we cannot protect our own at home. And so I think that this has to do with poverty. Not in a material way whatsoever. Not at all. I live in one of the richest neighborhoods in America. You know what neighborhood I live in right now? The same neighborhood where I live with Miss Jones. I'm the only senator in America that lives in a low-income, predominantly African-American, inner-city community. So if you want to talk about materially, but materially my community, according to the last census, is about $14,000 per household. When I go to the bodega, my friends, my neighbors use their Family First cards. But I have a rich community. People, I see their worth, I see their dignity, I see their value, I see what they bring to the table. I see they've got some kind, my neighbors have got some kind of magic going on where they can make dollars stretch, where they can figure out a way to juggle all the kind of pressures on their lives, where they work a full-time job, catch extra shifts, and still check homework. You know, I see some folk that work twice as hard as we do in Congress for a fraction of the pay, working full-time jobs, still at the poverty line. I mean, I see some amazing human resiliency and spirit. And so when I say the problem in America is poverty, it is poverty of compassion, it is poverty of empathy, it is poverty of action. It's not a matter of can we, it's a matter of do we have the collective will. And so I do preach love, not violence, but I say anger is a productive emotion. It is a constructive emotion. We should be angry that's still in America. 50 years since the Poor People's Campaign. That we are still fighting for things that help everybody. And so I want to end with just celebrating one more person from my community. One of these heroes. And I love him because he is one of the softest spoken people, but one of the most ferocious fighters for justice I've ever met. Some of you might know him, might remember him, because he was down here in DC all the time. Frank Hutchins was his name. And I'm telling you, I met Frank, Miss Jones introduced me to Frank. I met him in the apartment, and he had one of these, you know, there's an old saying, who you are speaks so loudly, I can't hear what you said. He's one of those people whose spirit was so present. I still remember one of the early tenant meetings we had in Brick Towers when we were going to file suit against the landlord. And it's one of these long tenant meetings, and like I'm recording stuff so we have it for the papers we're going to file. And after the second or third hour, I'm starting to get restless. I'm like, people want to come up with the microphone still, and I'm just like, okay, I got everything. But I'm looking at Frank. Love. Every person he walked up, he would look at them with love. Afterwards, we talked, and he's like, Cory, you don't understand. People need to be heard. You can't just cut it off because you got what you need for some legal filing. This is about so much more than that. Even if you heal the building, but you don't let folks get their healing. You know how traumatizing it is? He told me about this till I moved into Brick Towers, and then I was fighting roaches and fighting rats and learned how to heat my apartment using my oven and how to put the pot on top. You got to put the pot on top because you don't want to get dry heat there. I mean, these ladies would come in here and make fun of me in my apartment. She said, Cory, they taught me how to survive. And so Frank and I got to be friends, and then eventually he got me elected, helped to run my campaign. But Frank was getting old. He'd been around a long time. He led, still to this day, the longest rent strike in Newark's history against that slumlord we were talking about. He won against the Housing Authority in the 1970s in a place called Stella Wright, these high-rises in Newark. Some of you might have heard of them. But now Frank is starting to run down. He's getting older, and his eyesight started going. And we started this little funny thing where I would see him, and I knew he couldn't see me. I'd be, hey, Frank, it's Cory. Like, announcing myself so he knew who it is. He was like, I see you, Cory. And he would do funny things. Like, I would take him to the grocery store to go shopping and stuff like that. And he'd like, let's go to the movies. I'm like, Frank, you can't see the screen. And he's like, I just want to go and sit in the movies. And we'd go and sit there in the movies. It would be beautiful. He'd be eating popcorn, laughing and crying on the movie. I'm like, man, you got extra sensory perception. You're seeing more than I see because we were fully in every moment. And so Frank got older and older. I'm now mayor of the city. I still take time to come see him and take him around. And then eventually he was in hospice. And I would go there, and this is how my ego works. It's not how his ego works. My ego would be upset. This is a guy that's helped thousands and thousands of human beings get decent housing, stay in their homes, get heat, get hot water. Why isn't this place crowded with people? There was a handful of us that would go up and visit him, but something about it just angered me that like my ego was like, shouldn't he have lines outside celebrating his life? But you see, to Frank, life was not about popularity, it was about purpose. It wasn't about celebrity, it was about significance. It was not about how much you get in applause and praise, it was about how much you give in love and care. The last time I would see Frank alive, I get emotional still. I went to his room and the nurse said to me, this is probably going to be it. And some of you who sat with people, you have this shortness of breath, and he was breathing really, really quickly. And I go in, and Frank only could say two things to me the entire time I was there. I sat with him, I kissed him on the forehead, I told him what was happening in Newark, and it was a beautiful moment. And the only two things he said to me is when I walked in, I announced myself. I said, "Hey, Frank, it's Cory." And with much labor, he said, "I see you." And then when I was getting ready to leave, I kissed this guy on the forehead, and I just hold him and I say to Frank, "I love you." And that was the last thing he said to me. He goes, "I love you." And that's what I think about. He would die soon after, but I think about those two words. And I think about it because you all embody this. It's that spirit. I see you, I love you. I see you, I love you. You all know that love is not this soft, not this weak word. Love is the demanding word. Love means sacrifice. Love is hard. Love is difficult. Ms. Jones used to grab some of us and love on us pretty hard. Love does not tolerate injustice. Love will get in people's face. It is ferocious. It defends. And I worry about our nation sometimes when we have these lines that divide us, where sometimes we don't even see each other. We don't see each other's dignity. We don't see each other's humanity. Sometimes we're so close up on each other. The person that's going to clean the bathrooms in this hotel when we leave. Do we see the person that serves us at the IHOP making $2.13 an hour plus tips, and often they get this tips because they have to withstand sexual harassment? Are we seeing each other? Are we loving each other? I see you, I love you. I see you, I love you. This country, we've got to force it to look in the mirror. We got to force it to see its truth. Folk pray, put their hands on their hearts, and they swear an oath that we'll be a nation of liberty and justice for all. And yet there are folks right now who can't find housing. They've done everything right. There are folks right now who are homeless. They've done everything right. There are women who fled their homes from violence and abuse and are homeless. They've done everything right. There are people who served in jail for doing things that presidents and senators have admitted to doing and can't find housing when they get home. They've done everything right. We are not a nation of liberty and justice for all yet. But I'll tell you what, when whites and blacks got together to build that infrastructure project called the Underground Railroad, we weren't there yet, but they kept on fighting. When they used to meet in church basements and plan the civil rights movement, we weren't there yet, but they kept on marching. When suffragettes like Alice Paul from New Jersey went on hunger strikes until they ripped her into hospitals, shoved tubes down her throat, we didn't have equality and justice for all, but she kept fighting. This is where we are today. There are folks hurting in America. Our children are suffering in America. There are folks homeless in our country. There are people in housing that's substandard, that doesn't match their dignity in our country. And now's the choice we've got to make. It falls to us. There are folks comfortable and asleep that don't know the truth of this country. We got to wake them up. There are people who are in it just for themselves. We got to get them to love larger. And I'm going to tell you right now, this is the beauty. I believe if we see each other, if we love each other, I know that when our time comes, when it's time for us to pass the baton, like Frank and Miss Jones, we may not get to the mountaintop, but I'm telling you right now, we as a people will be on our way to the promised land. Thank you, everybody.
That was tremendous, Senator Booker. Thank you. What an incredible gift Senator Booker is. An incredible message. Thank you. So he has some time for questions and conversations, which is another incredible opportunity that we have. I'm going to start us off with one, and then others can think about what you want to ask Senator Booker while we have him here. So you've talked in the past about your parents and about them moving into Harrington Park, which was a predominantly white neighborhood, and the work, the opposition that they faced and the work that they had to do to integrate that neighborhood. So I'd love to hear, I think we'd all love to hear you reflect on that, especially now as we're approaching the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, sort of what you took from that and where you think we need to go next.
Right. My parents raised me to be very cognizant of the fact that that I, like we all do, drink deeply from wells of freedom, liberty, and opportunity that we didn't dig. My dad would just look at me as a young man growing up in a much more privileged environment than he did and be like, boy, don't you walk around this house like you hit a triple. You were born on third base, young man. You owe a debt. And the housing debt that I owe goes through my father's entire life. You know, his mom couldn't take care of him. His grandmother raised him for as well. His grandmother couldn't take care of him. And then he was in trouble. If it wasn't for people in the community that put a roof over his head, a family took him in. It wasn't his blood, wasn't my family's blood. I now say uncle and aunt, they're like my family, but my father was on the verge of homelessness, was rescued by people that took him in. My family, when they were trying to move into Harrington Park, as was referenced, they were denied housing because of the color of their skin. In 1969, if you were blacks trying to look for homes in northern New Jersey suburbs, you would get people telling you that these houses sold or it's been pulled off the market. My parents had to go to the Fair Housing Council, who set up a sting operation where they would literally send white couples to follow with my parents. The beautiful gift of the universe is that I was just in Cleveland about 2 weeks ago, helping out Sherrod Brown, who's an amazing champion for the issues we're talking about. And I finished my speech, and a woman runs up to me with my book and says to me, my family, my parents would follow your parents around in Harrington Park. And I gave her a hug. We all have people to thank that we don't thank enough. And so I grew up with this understanding that that people's activism around housing issues is why you are here and why you where you are. But I still worry. I worry about a lot of the accomplishments we made 50 years ago: voting rights, civil rights, housing rights. But here we are 50 years later, and it's almost like we got a Michael Jackson moonwalk syndrome, because we seem to be sliding backwards on a lot of things that a lot of ground that we gained. And we've so demonized low-income people in this country as if it's a moral condition. And what my father used to always say to me is we didn't make it because your father was hardworking and your mom was, no, we made it because we were fortunate, and we didn't have those traps that you can stumble into without any of your own making. And that's the problem, is we seem to have this moral sense of moral judgment on people. When more and more, remember, social mobility is a measurable indice. This country is more and more becoming a place of sticky poverty, where folks who are born, as that data point I read to you earlier, have a harder and harder time breaking out. And other countries, I always say, are out-Americaning us because they're finding ways to say, wait a minute, every child born, we should have in our country universal preschool. We should have in our country paid family leave. My friend whose kids I just recently took to the movies, Wakanda forever. I took some kids. My friend Natasha Laurel, I took her 3 sons to see Black Panther, and Natasha works at the IHOP. She's one of those people who makes $2.13 an hour, and she lives in public housing. She works full time, catches extra shifts where she can, and she still relies on public housing. But worse, the point I want to make is that for some people here from Newark know that the IHOP in Newark on Bergen Street is right across from University Hospital. And her son was in the emergency room for asthma, and now she has, as a working mom, single mom, she has that choice to make. Do I stay here and get this paycheck that I really need to even pay the rent that I'm being charged, a third of my income, or do I go across the street, give up this paycheck, and be there with my frightened child? And so these are the things that happen every day that Americans don't understand, that the system is fixed against you if you're poor. And everything, and I'll mention this and give you guys time for another question. This is a filibuster is what they call this. I'm sorry. But I just think about just the way that low-income people have to deal with the criminal justice system in ways that affluent people or people in certain communities don't have to. So you get fined and feed up the yin-yang. You get sort of an over-enforcement of fines and fees. You're more likely, there's no difference between blacks and whites in America for using drugs or dealing drugs, but you're almost 4 times more likely if you're African American to be stopped for it. But if you're in my community that I grew up in Harrington Park, nobody's getting stopped for marijuana in my community. It's Stanford University, no stopping and frisks going on if kids are coming home. And if they did, my college president hates when I say this, but they would find a lot of drugs, okay? But in communities, I challenged the vice cameras when I was walking with them. Every person we stopped, I asked the men in the community, had they ever been arrested for something? And everybody's like, yes. And so think about this now. You're a family that has been stopped by police, been incarcerated. Even if you're innocent, as Brian Stevenson says, we have a nation that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than poor and innocent. One stop by the police could cost you hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. Even if you prevail in the court processes, you now have lost a day at work or 2 days at work. And a lot of folks lose their jobs for that. So people don't understand how these things compound in our country. And by the way, everything I said, I really do believe it's a matter of not can we, it's a matter of collective will. When I was mayor, we decided that housing, I couldn't not do it with Frank Hutchins and Virginia Jones in my life, that we were going to try in the middle of a housing bubble had burst. We said our goal is to double the production of affordable housing. And we found a way to do it. We got thousands of units into the process, but we just did it because we were creative and we focused on the problem. We were able to do housing for people who were escaping domestic violence, housing for people with HIV and AIDS, housing for homeless veterans, because we focused on the problem. One city, one mayor, and an incredible community of advocates that were willing to work together. I told you about the program that Senator Menendez and I are trying to expand, which is an FHA program that says, look, take these troubled loans, bundle them, and let's go work with community development finance organizations and see if we can buy the loans back. It's going to be so much cheaper than letting a family go into foreclosure. And what happens if you put some investment in saving them? All of these things we have the capacity to do. We can show the balance sheet analysis to show that it's cheaper for a society to do it that way. But why is it that this country, from healthcare to the criminal justice system to housing, we are so much more comfortable in paying tons more on the back end of a problem as opposed to investing on the front end where it would be so much cheaper to do something about it?
I don't know about you all, but I could listen to you talk all day. But we're almost out of time. So we have one question. I saw this hand go up first, so I'll give it to you.
And tell me where you're from, too.
Yeah.
My name is Sue Mason. I'm the executive director of What's Next Washington in the other Washington. I'm also formerly incarcerated. And I want to thank you for the work that you're doing on the Dignity Act.
Thank you, thank you.
I also want to ask you about, so on any given night in Seattle, when they ask the homeless, there's 60% of those people have criminal convictions. And in Seattle, I'm a little nervous. Why am I so nervous? So in Seattle, we passed the most progressive housing bill in the nation last October. No one in the city of Seattle who applies for housing will have a background check pulled on them. You can check their credit, you can check to see if they have a job, but you cannot pull a criminal background check on anyone. Yay, right? So we'll be talking about that in a panel, but we want to get that passed at the county level, then at the state level, and I would love to see that as a national policy. I think that would be very helpful. Do you see that happening in the future? I know it's a heavy lift, but man, I would love to see it.
So first, let's get a hug here. Thank you. So, you'll never believe this. My biggest fear growing up was speaking in front of crowds. So I know I still feel a little nervous sometimes. But thank you for your leadership and your activism. I fell in love with Seattle when I started visiting the city. And I visited this Plymouth Housing Group. Do you know them? Yeah. So I went to Plymouth Housing Group that takes people with mental illness in need of supportive housing. They put them in supportive housing. Incredible communities they created. I visited with some of their residents. These incredible human beings. And they did this little study where they studied the cost to Seattle taxpayers of homeless folks on the street versus supportive housing. Now, any of us who've been mayors and activists know how supportive housing is expensive. But they did a study for 23 Seattleans versus the cost of them on the street versus the cost of them in supportive housing, all in. They saved Seattle taxpayers $1 million. And that's because why? What happens? Well, you say that the 60% have a criminal record. Well, a lot of times their criminality is just their homelessness, and they put them in jail. And how much is that? We got a great housing system in America. It's called jail, and it is so much more expensive than doing it right. There are more people in the South in jails than there are in college campuses. And it is a gross expenditure. 1 out of every 3 incarcerated women on the planet Earth, 1 out of every 3 is here in the United States of America. And we, whether they're mentally ill, homeless, or women, we take the most vulnerable people and crush them into hyper-expensive systems that only hurt them more. At a hearing today in the Judiciary Committee, we're trying to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. And I just was shaken by women, because I would talk about criminal justice reform all over the place, and women would raise their hands and take me to task like they got possessed by the spirit of Miss Jones, and they would be like, you always talk about incarceration, but you never talk about the circumstances facing women, which I just didn't know. Like, I went to go visit Danbury, Connecticut lockup, and now that I was more enlightened, I asked the warden, what percentage of the women here are survivors of sexual trauma? And she looked at me and she goes, 95% of my women have been raped, have been sexually abused. We take the most vulnerable people who are survivors of horrors. And in fact, the report I put in the record today was a study that was done about the sexual assault to prison pipeline. We often take the kids, the girls we put into prisons. A number of studies show these are the girls that have often been exploited and put in horrible situations and end up with criminal convictions. And those are not trauma-informed care facilities. They're places that do things that compound sexual trauma, like solitary confinement, shackling pregnant women. We do things that are out of a Byzantine era here in the United States. And so I just, again, to the incredible leader from Seattle, I didn't get your name one more? Sue. Sue. We're going to win a lot of these battles, not here in Washington first. We're going to win them in local communities and states that want to be progressive and begin to show models of the change. Like the over-incarceration of marijuana in this country. I put the first major bill for marijuana legalization, which is not the... You're talking to a guy who's never drank alcohol. It's not my brother standing up. Amen. But the bill, often people see the marijuana legalization part, and they don't see the part that I put in there, which is, hey, this has got to be about justice and about restorative justice. So when there are all these taxes that are being created, I'm like, we need to reinvest in communities that are disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs. We need to expunge records, because it's ironic to me that in some states, now they've legalized this stuff, but formerly incarcerated people for marijuana crimes can't get a business license to benefit from the now legalized business. And so this is now being attention, because the federal government is slow. I can't get them to move on this bill, even though I have bipartisan co-sponsors of some of my efforts. But the states, they're showing the truth of what works, and eventually that truth is going to set us all free. And so on housing, I'm so happy in New Jersey we've got a much more progressive governor. I'm hoping that we can, some Jersey people here, that we in New Jersey can get back to the business of our state used to try to lead the country in innovative pilot programs and examples, but you clearly are leading it. I want to end with just a moment, if I can just end, because I know my staff's probably going crazy. They want to drag me back to the Hill, which is not as fulfilling and affirming as this place. You all, I need this every day, every morning. Can we all meet at my apartment in Washington? And let me start my day with energy like this. So, but I do want to say to you, I feel like I'm telling these tough stories, like the passing of Frank Hutchins. But I do want to just say a moment that Miss Jones really, I mean, she just gave me gifts that I'm telling you, not a week goes by where I don't thank her. And this is one of the gifts she gave me. I already said to you that she said hope is the active conviction that despair will never have the last word. And that's why this has been the most hopeful year of my life. People hear that and they're like, what? Do you know who president is, Cory? And I'm like, he's like, you need to stop presenting those bills on marijuana, Cory. What are you talking about? But it's the most hopeful year of my life is because every time I, with a fancy title and a good taxpayer-funded salary, every time I want to indulge in despair, community folk tell me to get up. This is not, Cory, don't curl up, shut up, or give up. Get up, stand up, rise up, speak up. I was feeling all down on the day of the inauguration, and back in last January, not this past one, and I went home with a throbbing headache, curled up in bed, and then the next day, women, hundreds of thousands, and were like, it's like I heard the voice of Miss Jones, get up, get out of bed, go join the marchers. They're not giving up, they're showing what hope is. When the Muslim ban happened, and I go out to Dulles Airport, and it was people, everyday Americans, who were there cheering Muslim families, packed concourse. I saw guys in kipahs with tzitzis hanging out, cheering Muslim families coming off of a plane, and I'm like, this is what America looks like. When they try to rip health care away from 40 million plus Americans, I watched the Capitol fill up with thousands and thousands of people who were saying just, no, disabled children, they call themselves the little lobbyists, rolling in front of senators and saying, don't take my health care away. This is who we are. We're activists. We've seen demagoguery before. We've seen hatred before. We've seen powerful people rise and try to hurt the powerlessness, hurt people without power. But we always forget that the power of the people is always greater than the people in power. And so in Newark, on the top of my block last week, Shahad gunned down. And it hurt me because Shahad was gunned down. Shahad hung out with a crew in my lobby of a whole bunch of other people. Hassan Washington, Little Haas, a bunch of other young kids, all of whom have been murdered. And I understand Parkland. I understand these mass shootings, what happened in Maryland today. But in my community, we have these things, unfortunately, even though my mayor's driven down the rate of violent crime, we still have shootings. I've had 2 on my block within the last year. And so on a day that I was there where a kid was murdered and tried to stop him from bleeding to death, I was so angry, so ready to give up. I went home, and some of you know this, that you sometimes shut the door to your bathroom and you hurt so much on the inside. Some of you might have done that. This was a night I stood in the shower, put the water as hot as I could stand it, hoping the pain on the outside would dull the pain on the inside. I just was so angry at my country that at that point I felt like everybody knew who Natalie Holloway was or JonBenet Ramsey, but they couldn't name Hassan Washington. They couldn't name the kids in my neighborhood, the unsolved murders. And so that next morning, I get up, I go downstairs, and this is the message I want to leave you with from Miss Jones. I go downstairs, I walk through that lobby where Miss Jones' son was killed, and I get into the courtyard, and Miss Jones is looking at the street at Martin Luther King Boulevard. It's only us between the two buildings, and I stop there, and I'm feeling like I'm 100 feet underwater, drowning, trying desperately to get air. And then she turns around and she sees me, and she doesn't say anything. She just did what I needed at that moment. She put her arms out. And here I am, 6'3", but I ran across that courtyard like a little kid, jumped up into Miss Jones's arms, figuratively. And she hugs me and rubs my back, and she only says 2 words over and over and over again. 2 words, she repeats them over and over and over again. And the 2 words I leave you with are 2 words I thought about when I would eventually become mayor and would have tough days. The 2 words I've thought about when I get frustrated at our country. And I'm a big believer in this. If America hasn't broken your heart, you don't love her enough. And I repeat these 2 words here in Washington all the time. When I watch them try to rip healthcare away, when I watch them pass this awful tax bill, I say Miss Jones's words. And so as she rubbed my back, as I burst into tears and cried like a child on her shoulders, she held me knowing what I had been through the day before. She said these 2 words over and over again. She said, stay faithful, stay faithful, stay faithful. Let's keep the faith in our country. Let's know that faith has brought us this far. Not faith pie in the sky when you die, but faith in each other. Faith in ideals like love, faith in our principles and our ideals, and faith that knows that American history is a perpetual testimony to the achievement of impossible things. Through our faith, through our sacrifice, through our work, through our love, I know that brighter days are ahead. And as I said at the conclusion of my remarks, I know that we as a people will get to the promised land. Thank you, everybody.